I had an ugly flat panel door on a little storeroom on our deck that had been deteriorating in the weather, and I wanted to build a panel door out of solid wood. And I thought what I would use is cedar, and I thought on top of that I would use cheap fence boards. And so I went to the local home center and bought what they sort of pass for a 1x6 nowadays. They're really about 5/8 of an inch by 5.5, and I planed them, glued them up in 3 plies, and made my door frame out of cedar fence boards. The one advantage that I had is that they were dry. I was able to load them up on the top of my car and bring them home. And the first item of interest was I wanted to get them down to close to a 1/2 inch, because I was going to glue them up in 3 plies, and I wanted my doors finished width to be 1.5 inches. And so I planed these. The other reason I planed them, not only to get them to a consistent dimension, but I wanted to smooth them, because since they were fence boards, they were rough sawn. They had sort of a resawn look, and they would not glue well. And so due to their dryness and their ability to be planed very smoothly, they actually glued up very well. I used a waterproof glue and was able to glue them up in such a way that they were a 3-ply, and at the corners they would overlap with sort of half-lap joints that I'll show you in a moment. It made for a very strong door frame, and I'm hoping a door frame that will last well in the weather. Once I had planed those boards down to close to a 1/2 inch, I trimmed them a little bit further just to make the gluing less surface. I wanted them to be finished width at about 4.5 inches. So by the time I was done straightening and squaring everything, I had 1.5 by 4.5 stiles and rails to build this door out of. So I simply covered them in glue, made them into little 3-ply sandwiches for the 2 long stiles left and right. And for the top rail, the bottom rail, I did double thickness or double height, so it ended up at about 10.5 inches high by 1.5 inches thick. And I just simply glued these up in 3 plies, clamped them in 3 plies. I was careful as I clamped these glue ups to make sure that they were deadly straight. It's pretty easy in a ply kind of a glue up to put a little too much tension here or there with a clamp and end up with a curved board instead of a straight board. And I surely wanted this to be straight because I wanted it to close nicely into the frame, and also to square up nicely when I glued up all the corners. So again, I just smeared these with glue, glued them up in little 3-ply sections. And when I clamped them, I clamped them a ton, because I wanted them to be super tight. I wanted them to basically act like a 2x6. When I was cutting them, planing edges, mortising for hinges or door latches or hardware, I wanted that to act like a 2x6. And so I clamped them a lot, making sure I had great squeeze out, and again, a very straight board when I was done. The bottom section is probably the most unusual in that, since it was more than just 3 pieces of wood, I took one length of wood and ripped it in half, and so that the bottom layer is a half of a width of the 1x, or I'm going to call them 1x's, but they're now like half bys, and then a full-sized one, again leaving it long because it becomes the tenon that goes into the side mortises, another full-size board on top of that for the middle that's going to end up with a groove cut in it for the center panel. This will all make sense in a bit. And then the top layer, again, 2 half-size pieces and a full one in the middle. This way I had a sandwich, I had overlapping seams, it glued up, again, very tight. It acted like basically a 2x12 when I was done, with most of the shaping done for me already. All I had to do was final cut the tenons on each end. And let me just show you in an illustration of how this end went together, because I think this really helps. You'll see that everything is sort of interlocking. You can see the groove that is cut in the side stiles to accept the center panel. There's also a groove in the top of this lower panel that accepts those sides as well. That's how the bottom piece was made. The side stile, if you remove that bottom, you'll see that the sides are also grooved to accept the tenon as that slides in. The top is basically the same idea. The sides are the same idea. The idea was that the thing would sort of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. I'd have a tight fitting corners. It would stay square. I'm hoping because of the dryness of the wood, it will stay relatively stable. And you can just see by these close-ups sort of how this goes together. I'm showing this drawing as if these are 2x6s and 2x12s, but just bear in mind that these are put together like a sandwich. Anyway, that's kind of gives you an idea of how this thing went together, and we'll be looking at the real deal here in a minute. As for the center panel, I basically used single ply pieces of the fence board, so the center panel is a 1/2 of an inch thick. It's made up of 4 or 5 boards. I used a dado blade and cut, made like shiplap out of it so that the seams would overlap each other, just in case someday through shrinkage or whatever it would still not be see-through, so to speak. And so I just grabbed a bunch of what was left of these fence boards and planed them down to get a uniform thickness of about a 1/2 an inch, so that when I cut with a dado blade a groove in the stiles and rails, this center panel could be free floating. That way, if it shrinks and the stiles and rails don't, it will just move within the groove rather than split. And that's actually very, very common as far as a floating panel door. So here is a sort of an illustration of how I cut those. It gave me more glue surface as well when I glued them up, and so it ended up being a nice 1/2 inch, very rigid panel. So here I'm setting up with my dado blade on a sacrificial fence against my existing fence, and with this set at 1/2 of the depth of the board, I was able to just run these boards through and cut a shiplap kind of a finish. These are practice boards right now, just in order to get the depth exactly right. But once I had that, I ran all those boards. I think there's only 3 or 4 or 5 total through this dado blade, and cut my shiplap overlaps. Then for the glue up, and I've got another video on this. For the glue up, I found a piece of scrap, drilled a couple holes in it, and put my pipe clamps in it vertically. This would allow me easy access to both the front and the back of the glue up for clamping cauls. Was not important as far as strength or rigidity, or all that was really important to me on this center panel was that it was flat, because it was going to have to fit into a 1/2-inch groove cut in the stiles and rails of the door. So having these pipe clamps vertical allowed me the ability to get on top of and underneath this panel with clamping cauls in order to ensure that it was nice and flat. And indeed it came out that way. It came out nice and rigid, very flat, in a very flat plane, so that once I had cut the 1/2-inch groove in the stiles and rails, this slid in just perfectly snug, but allowing enough room to move for expansion and contraction. Now with my 3-ply glue-ups, my 2x material, so to speak, I was able to run these through the planer one last time to get a smooth surface on both sides and to get them down to my final 1.5-inch width or depth. And so I ran all these pieces through the planer over and over until I got them exactly to where I wanted them as far as finished depth or width. And I wanted them all to be run through the planer at the same time, so that when these corners meet up, they meet up flush and level. So here's a quick illustration of the way this thing went together. Again, you can see that bottom section is really made up of 5 different pieces of wood glued in a sandwich. And as those go together, the tenons go into the mortise, so to speak, of the side stiles. Similarly, the top one is a 3-ply glue up, but the center ply again becomes the tenons to go into the mortises, so to speak, of the sides. The sides, the centerpiece was shorter, creating the mortise for those sides to fit into. So here's kind of one in real life. I'm just doing a test fit right now just to see that 1/2-inch material fit snugly in the 1/2-inch tenon. I had to fuss with them a little bit with a shoulder plane to get a nice tight fit and to get it to snug up tightly, but after a little bit of fussing around, it worked out. And then you can see I'm showing there where the groove will be dadoed into those pieces in order to accept the center panel. So now I've got to kind of fine tune. This is that bottom rail, and what I'm doing now is fine tuning, cutting the rest of what will become the tenon, because this is sort of a stepped tenon. The long part you see hanging out there will go into the mortise in the side rails, but there also needs to be like a 3/4 inch long tenon on this that will go into the groove cut in the side rails that accept the flat panel. Again, if you remember that illustration, you see this stuff all ends up going together tightly. So I just adjusted the blade on my sled to be just touching the surface of that tenon, and basically just elongated the tenon by running it through. And then I flattened it out using a shoulder plane to take all that remnant off of there. And it planed down smoothly. It planed down to where it fit tightly in the groove that was dadoed into the sides. And once it was all fine-tuned, it went together very, very well with the side rails. These parts fitting in tightly, gluing lots of glue surface, and yet leaving the groove glue-free so that the center panel would have the ability to expand and contract with moisture. So here I've set my dado blade at a 1/2 inch width. I've centered it in the 3-ply pieces, and now I'm running the length of those to cut the groove. I cut the groove a 1/2 inch wide and about 3/4 of an inch deep. And then I cut the panel with enough room to have like a 1/4 of an inch on all 4 sides. I thought that would allow me enough expansion and contraction space so that that panel in the middle could move freely and not be splitting as it shrank or breaking out the sides of the frame of the door as it expanded. So I just ran these through a dado blade. Again, set it a 1/2 inch wide and 3/4 inch deep, and I ran all 4 of the pieces through that blade to make the groove to accept the center panel. So here's a dry fit, and I just tapped this together, checked it with my square, and it came out nice and square. You can see how the groove here is continuing around all 4 pieces. There it is with the panel inside. Again, dry fit. And dry fit's a good idea to make sure everything's going to match up nicely before you commit yourself to the glue. But I was very pleased with this dry fit, and I checked it with my square. Here it is clamped up to be after the glue. I clamped up the corners. I wanted the sandwiches again to be super tight. So I clamped all 4 corners. I clamped the side stiles tightly together to grab the top and bottom rail. And I think I had one more long clamp to just kind of seize up the corner because it was out of square by just a hair, and I wanted to get it perfect. And so before I left this to dry, I checked it with my square, checked all 4 corners, and I was pretty convinced I had a square door, or a door with 90-degree corners. So there it is, it glue up, and I'm pulling the clamps off now. All of the sandwiches, so to speak, however you want to describe those, came out nice and tight with no gaps. You can see the end is still kind of wild as far as the length of the door, and the edges are also a little wild. This still is going to get trimmed on all 4 sides to give me a nice clean edge, because clamps tend to make a mess and dents in the cedar. It's so soft. So once I had done this and pulled all the clamps off, kind of checked it one last time for square, I was happy with it. It was time to trim it. So here I've set my saw with the fence way down there. This door's finished width is coming out at about 28 inches wide. And so I set my blade 28 inches from the fence, and the blade high enough to cut. And on the long rips, I just ran it through. The blade was sharp enough that it didn't beat up the wood at all. And when you do this with a glued surface like that, once this comes out of the saw, you get just a very nice, flat, smooth, again, sort of a 2x. This 3-ply becomes as if it were a 2x6. And it gives you a nice edge to either mortise for the door latch or to mortise for the hinges. As far as the length, my saw, I can't get the fence that far away from the blade, so I double-sided tape a piece of aluminum bar down to the door. I put some painter's tape at the cut edge so that it wouldn't splinter the wood or have tear out when the blade was coming up, back up through the surface. And I cut both the bottom and the top this way. Again, I made sure that that aluminum bar was square using my square and a little 3/4/5 measurement. And then as carefully as I could, I guided the saw through and cut the bottom and the top off. And I was very happy with the cuts. They came out cleanly. After you pull the tape off, you can see that you end up with a pretty clean cut just needed a little bit of light sanding top and bottom in order to take the paint well. And that bar works great as a guide, and it stays out of the way of all the different things that are hanging out of the saw. Now, I have another video on this. I had to make a jig to cut the mortise for the door latch, and I did it the way I always do it. I just raised the blade on my table saw through a piece of plywood that has been cut square, so that when I raise the blade through the plywood, I'm getting 90-degree corners that are perfectly 90 degrees with each other. So after a tiny bit of adjusting, I was able to raise the blade through the board right on the lines to match the size of the door latch hardware. You notice I've got a small line about 1/16 of an inch outside of the line that I traced around the latch, and that's because my bushing on my router and my bit are 1/16 of an inch different, and so the template size and the actual size of the hole are different by 1/16 of an inch all the way around. So once I've cut this out, I've got this rectangle that's exactly 1/16 of an inch bigger on all four sides than the mortise that I need for the latch, and I simply then, with double-sided tape, I'm going to do a little practice run here with double-sided tape over this is just a cutoff of one of the 3-plies. I drilled a hole in it for the latch, tracing the outline, then I double-sided tape the template down and run my router around on it. And what I end up with is a perfect rectangle that fits the latch tight and nice. And so I did it first on the test to make sure it was going to be good, and then used it on the real door. As for the hinges, similarly, I've got this great little bit. It's a 1/2 inch in diameter, hence a 1/4 inch radius corner, and the hinges I bought were 1/4 inch radius hinges. And so with a 3-sided template, double-sided taped to the door, and you just run your router down 3 sides, the radius that it leaves in the corners exactly matches that of the hinge, and you end up with a really nice fitting, tight-fitting hinge mortise. Then I have this drill bit that centers the hole by fitting into the tapered hole in the hinge. It centers the bit, and I just drilled my pilot holes so that when it came time to fasten the hinges to the door, I had my holes pre-drilled, and the hinges fit super tightly into the mortises once they were screwed down. So after this, I primed the door and then painted the door with 2 coats of latex stain, solid body stain like the rest of my house. Here's the door before the hardware with 1 coat of paint on it. After a 2nd coat of paint, I hung the hardware on it, and there it is on the outside. I still need to paint that trim and do a little bit of cleanup, but all in all, a nice looking door, solid cedar, should way outlast the door that was there previously, and it has a nice paneled look to it. I actually wanted the seams to show because I wanted it to look like a panel, and that's what it looks like. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.